A country that desperately needs money. It needs roads, hospitals, schools, electricity, jobs. So it borrows. At first, everything seems perfectly reasonable. But then interest accumulates. The economy slows down. The currency weakens. And suddenly the country needs another loan, partly to repay the first one. Then another, and another. Years pass. Billions of dollars have been paid back. But strangely, the debt is even bigger than before. So here is the question: who is really benefiting from this system? The borrowing country, or the people who own the debt? That question sits at the heart of Eric Toussaint's book, Your Money or Your Life: The Tyranny of Global Finance. And despite its title, this is not really a book about personal finance. It is about something much bigger. It is about how money moves between countries, how debt can influence governments, and how financial power can eventually become political power. Toussaint begins with globalization. We normally hear globalization described as countries becoming more connected, more international trade, more investment, more opportunities. And certainly globalization has done all of those things. But Toussaint asks us to look at another side of the story. From the 1980s onward, many governments began opening their financial markets, reducing restrictions on capital, privatizing state enterprises, and reducing government involvement in parts of the economy. Financial markets became increasingly global. Money could cross borders faster and more freely than ever before. And according to Toussaint, something fundamental changed. Finance was no longer simply supporting the economy. Increasingly, the economy was being reorganized around finance. The book describes this as the growing financialization of the global economy and argues that financial markets became powerful enough to significantly restrict the economic choices available to governments. But the most powerful part of the book begins when Toussaint turns to debt. Normally, debt seems simple. You borrow money, you use it, and eventually you repay it with interest. But what happens when an entire country cannot repay? It cannot simply sell its house. It cannot take another job. And it cannot disappear. Usually, it needs more financing. And that creates a dangerous possibility. New debt can be used to service old debt. Toussaint gives a remarkable historical example. According to figures presented in the book, between 1980 and 1992, developing countries paid approximately $1.666 trillion in principal and interest. Yet Toussaint points out that despite these enormous payments, their overall debt continued to grow. In his words and analysis, new borrowing was increasingly being used to repay previous borrowing. Think about that for a moment. Imagine borrowing $100. You pay back $20. But because you don't have enough money to survive and continue making payments, you borrow again. Now you owe $120. You make another payment. Then borrow again. You are paying, but you are not escaping. That is the debt trap Toussaint wants the reader to understand. And this is where institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank enter the story. When countries experience severe financial problems, international institutions can provide financing. But that financing can come with conditions. These conditions may involve controlling government expenditure, liberalizing trade, privatizing state enterprises, reforming financial systems, devaluing currencies, or restructuring parts of the economy. These packages became widely known as structural adjustment programs. The official logic sounds reasonable: stabilize the economy. correct the imbalance, restore growth, increase exports, and make the country capable of repaying its obligations. But Toussaint argues that we need to ask another question: adjustment for whom? Because when a government cuts expenditure, those cuts are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Behind those numbers are hospitals, schools, public employees, subsidies, wages, infrastructure, and ordinary families. Toussaint argues that austerity and structural adjustment often weakened living standards while ensuring that debt servicing continued. He describes policies involving austerity, liberalization, and privatization being implemented across numerous debtor countries. And this brings us to perhaps the most important idea in the entire book. Who actually pays a country's debt? Technically, the government does. But where does government money come from? Taxes, exports, natural resources, public revenues, and the economic activity of millions of ordinary people. So Toussaint argues that debt repayment can become a mechanism for transferring wealth. Workers produce, businesses produce, farmers produce, countries export, governments collect revenue, and a portion of that wealth eventually flows toward creditors and holders of capital. Toussaint therefore describes debt as much more than a financial relationship. He sees it as a relationship of power. And here the argument becomes even more interesting. Because Toussaint is not simply saying that rich countries are bad and poor countries are victims. The picture he paints is more complicated. Powerful groups inside developing countries can benefit too. Domestic holders of capital can move their money abroad. Political elites can make poor decisions. Local wealthy groups can benefit from privatization and financial arrangements. So the divide is not always simply north versus south. It can also be those who depend mainly on their labor versus those who control capital. The book argues that debt repayment can transfer wealth toward holders of capital both in richer countries and within debtor countries themselves. Then there is another danger. Money can enter a country very quickly. Investors arrive. Asset prices rise. Credit expands. Everything looks successful. But confidence changes quickly, and capital can leave almost as quickly as it arrived. Businesses collapse. Currencies fall. Banks come under pressure. And governments are left trying to contain the crisis. Toussaint uses the financial crises of the 1990s, particularly the Asian crisis, to argue that unrestricted movement of capital can itself become a source of instability. This reveals one of the biggest contradictions discussed throughout the book. Capital is encouraged to move freely around the world, while governments remain responsible for dealing with the social consequences when things go wrong. Profits can be private, but losses can become public. And when financial institutions become important enough to threaten the entire economy, governments may have little choice but to intervene. Toussaint therefore challenges another popular assumption that the private sector is always efficient, while the public sector is inherently inefficient. He points to financial failures and private sector debt crises to argue that private institutions can make disastrous decisions too. The book even discusses the collapse of long-term capital management in 1998, a highly sophisticated investment fund advised by celebrated financial economists, which required intervention because its failure threatened wider financial stability. For Toussaint, examples like this expose a contradiction. Markets are supposed to discipline themselves until their failure threatens everyone else. Then, society is asked to rescue them. But after spending most of the book diagnosing the problem, Toussaint eventually asks, what is the alternative? And this is important. He does not present one magical solution. In fact, he explicitly says his proposals should be viewed as ideas for discussion rather than a complete program. Among the alternatives he discusses are cancelling unsustainable debts of the poorest countries, regulating capital movements, reconsidering the role of the IMF and World Bank, strengthening domestic economies, increasing South-South cooperation, prioritizing essential human needs, and giving societies greater democratic control over economic decisions. Whether you agree with all of Toussaint's solutions or not, the question raised by the book is difficult to ignore. What is an economy ultimately for? Is the purpose of an economy simply to satisfy financial markets, to maximize returns, to maintain debt payments at any social cost? Or should finance ultimately serve human development? Because money itself is only a tool. Debt is a tool. Banks are tools. Financial markets are tools. And international institutions are supposed to be tools. But when the tool begins controlling the person who is supposed to use it, something has changed. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning behind the title, Your Money or Your Life. The book forces us to ask whether societies should organize human life around the demands of finance or organize finance around the needs of human life. And there is one final reason this book remains worth reading. It was written more than 2 decades ago. Its examples come largely from the debt crises and financial upheavals of the 1980s and 1990s, so its numbers should be understood in their historical context. But the question it leaves us with is timeless. When debt becomes so powerful that it determines what a society can spend, what it can own, and what economic choices it can make, is it still just debt? Or has debt become power? And maybe understanding that difference is the first step toward understanding how the global financial system really works.